Okay, yes, let's get started. Well, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the Health Tech CoLab's Distinguished Speaker Series. This is our first event in the new Health Tech CoLab, which is the space on campus dedicated to innovation in health technologies, with a special focus on increasing access to quality healthcare. And our Distinguished Speaker Series is aimed at bringing those who have already made great contributions in this field to bringing them to Berkeley and sharing their expertise with the student teams, as well as the faculty and staff, about how they've been able to accomplish what they've done. A few housekeeping items. So remember Zoom rules. Please stay muted if you're joining us online, and save your questions until the Q&A portion that's just after the presentation. So there's gonna be plenty of time for discussion. And if you have a question, use the raise hand function in Zoom, or you can just type your question in the chat and we'll make sure to ask that. If you're in the room, the Health Tech CoLab, then please raise your hand, and Karenna has a microphone that is needed in order for us to hear what, us online to hear what you're saying. So a little bit about the Health Tech CoLab. We're just getting started. We launched this past fall, and we've been able to have a rapid start and have already accepted a first cohort of CoLab teams, which provides those teams with guaranteed prototype and working space, as well as access to prototyping facilities across the Berkeley campus. And interactions with subject matter experts, such as the one we have here today. And we're working on building a CoLab community that can accelerate our efforts to develop and field and test new health technologies. So we're really excited about building more activities into the Health Tech CoLab, and this Distinguished Speaker Series is a central part of that. We're going to be highlighting experts from across the healthcare ecosystem, and that includes our speaker today, who'll be talking about engineering for the end user, but also aspects of regulation, of how to go about startups in the health tech space, and so on and so forth. So those are going to be organized for 5 p.m. on Thursdays, monthly, and we'll be sharing the schedule of the future talks soon. So stay tuned for more of the Distinguished Speaker Series. So for today, it's my pleasure to introduce Partha Marella. So Partha is the Executive Vice President and Global Head of Manufacturing for HCL Technologies. And HCL is the founding partner for the Health Tech CoLab. And we're grateful for HCL support for this vision and support for the activities in the CoLab. Now, Partha is exactly the kind of person we need to hear from, as you all have probably been hearing about supply chain challenges. How do we make more tests? How do we make more masks? Manufacturing is no small challenge, and we're going to get to hear from an expert in manufacturing and understanding about how do you design technologies for the end user. He's had over 16 years of experience in medical device companies and commercialization, and all the aspects that go into making devices that actually end up helping people. And that's including strategy, business development, and much more. So it's a wonderful pleasure to welcome Partha virtually, and we're eager to welcome him in person at some point in the near future. So I will stop sharing my slides and turn it over to Partha to share his.
Thank you, Dan and Karina, for putting this together and inviting me for this event. It's truly an honor and a privilege to be speaking to young minds who I believe are going to shape the future of our healthcare ecosystem. So let me share my screen, and we will, I hope you guys are able to see my screen.
Yes, can see it just fine.
Okay.
The slides look great.
Uh, can we move ahead, Dan? If you guys are able to hear and see me and
Yes.
my screen. Okay,
yes,
good.
Hear and see you, and welcome to go right ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So the topic today is engineering a medical device for the end user. Before I get started, I thought I'll quickly share a couple of snippets about who I am and what I do for a living. So I'm a technology evangelist. I have been trying to be, ingraining myself in terms of learning technology because it's a ubiquitous thing around us. Technology is all around us, and it is far more pregnated into all aspects of industries that we operate in. I've lived for about 20 years of my life in India, and I'm a cricket buff. For those of you who don't know what it is, it's a funny game played by 11 members on each side and watched by, as Sir Winston Churchill once said, played by 11 people and watched by 11 million fools. It's a fun game, something that I really enjoy. COVID has taught a lot of things, and I've tried to start strumming a guitar. So I'm an aspiring guitarist and a weekend dad. But one thing I must say about myself, I come from a doctor's family. So my parents, my mother, my father, my brother, my paternal uncles and grandfathers, everyone in my family is a doctor. So I have grown up in an ecosystem where there was a lot of talk around the dinner table, talking about surgeries and episodes of care in India. So I was a dark horse. I took a approach to go and do my engineering in electronics in Bangalore, a city in India, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. And then I went on to do my MBA. Just a word of, just a disclaimer, HCL is not a medical devices company. We are a technology company, and I've been in this company for the last 17 years, running two businesses. In my current role, I run global medical devices as a business, and I also run manufacturing. With that, I just want to kind of get into a quick snippet of what HCL does, and then we will move forward. HCL is your typical garage setup. It started in the 1970s with about $50. Our founders started this company, and today we are $11.5 billion company, operating in about 52 countries with about 200,000 people into three lines of businesses: IT and business services, engineering and R&D, and products and software products and platforms. These are the three things that we do. And one of the things that we do in engineering space, especially, is we try and help our customers in terms of helping them drive innovation in their fields. And hence you will see on the chart that HCL has helped our customers file almost about 1,500 patents and IPs for our customers in about 100 labs that are spread worldwide. So we operate in a multitude of verticals, right from aerospace, automotive, healthcare, semiconductor, servers and storage, and so on and so forth. Now, the way we have tried to build our healthcare space is we have been in this industry for the last 20 years. So we started almost in about the year 2000. And currently we are partners, R&D partners to about 8 of the top 10 global medical device companies. And we have supported close to about 200 medical products that have been launched. So we supported them through their R&D journey and have a staff of close to about 6,000 people in the R&D function supporting our customers. So what I'm going to share with you from now on is an outside-in perspective of a technology company that has supported so many medical device companies in their journey of launching a product, the kind of challenges that they went through, the kind of engineering rigor that needs to be brought in, and how do they build a product to address the changing demands in this particular market. Before we get started, one of the things that I wanted to spend some time is the unique feature of economics that happens in the healthcare industry. As some of you guys might already be knowing, for every $6 that is spent in the US, $1 is spent on the healthcare ecosystem, either directly or indirectly. But the economics of this industry is very, very rare and unique. For instance, the one who is receiving the services is not the one who is paying for it. The one who is paying for the service is not the one who is receiving the service. And the one who is offering the service is not setting the price for this service. Very unique construct of economics that are out there in this industry. And perhaps the reason for this is because as patients who are the end users of healthcare or consumers of healthcare, patients are perhaps not the best people to decide what is the treatment best for them. So there is a doctor or a physician or a caregiver. And then there are multiple nuances of and rules by which these payments are made. There are 3 sets of rules. These are driven by 3 sets of rules. I put them into 3 broad buckets. One is a bucket which calls who is going to finance. So these rules will define whether the financing of that is done by government, such as Medicare or Medicaid, or it is going to be done by your private insurance, where it depends on the coverage and the insurers that are coming into play. The second set of rules are those which primarily define the kind of access that a patient gets. So for instance, these rules will define the kind of dental plan you will have. These rules will define the number of routine exams that you can avail in a year. And that defines how the healthcare is set up. And the third set of rules are the rules which define how much is paid for a service. So for instance, let's say you are a medical device company and you have a knee implant as a product. For the same product, you might get $2,000 in a hospital in New York. You might get $1,000 in a hospital in Indianapolis. You might get $500 in France, and you might get $100 in India. The product is the same, but the payouts, either in the same country or in different geographies, will not be the same. And there are rules for it, which is why healthcare economics is a very important part of understanding before you embark on trying to figure out how to kind of penetrate into this particular market. Let us understand some very interesting elements of product development. So the unique feature about this industry is that it's a very, very regulated industry. There are very few industries around us which are as regulated and stringent as healthcare industry is. For instance, aerospace is one that comes very close to the amount of rigor and regulation that happens on a product. So before we embark on a product development, one must think about what kind of risk does it provide, or risk profile does it provide to its users, which then helps in defining a class 1 or a class 2 or a class 3 product. These risk classifications hold significant importance in the way you create your engineering plan and the way you launch this product in the market. Similarly, there are multiple stakeholders where you take this product. Sometimes it could be a scenario where you sell the product directly to a patient. In most of the cases, the end users could be physicians or caregivers. So it's an important facet to think about who is going to be using this product and how you're going to sell the product. We just talked a little bit about the reimbursement pathways, which is basically who is going to pay for the device. What are the kind of revenue models that exist? Are you going to sell the device? Are you going to lease it? Are you going to make money like for instance, more on the disposables rather than on the sale of the device? These are things that need to be thought through when you're building a particular product ecosystem. And last but not the least, the 800-pound gorilla in the room. which is your regulatory approval. In medical devices, if it is a medical device which is used to define and help in providing some therapy or care, then it has to be approved by a regulatory authority. In the US, it is FDA. Now, most of the class 1 devices may or may not need approvals, but a class 2 device where it presents a certain level of risk profile to the user will need to go through a regulatory approval. Typically, in the not too distant past, we used to have an ecosystem called a 510K submission. The 510K submission is a process where you take a predicate device or an existing device, which is similar in functionality, intended use, and risk profile, and you prove that your new product is similar with respect to the risk profile and intended use, and you can get a regulatory approval. But with the changing technologies, more and more companies are finding it difficult to find a predicate device, which is why there is a new pathway called de novo submission that has come into play for a class 2 device, where one must look at including a risk profile of the product and then including clinical trial documentation before it can be taken to a regulatory authority for an approval. So this plays a big role in terms of both its time, complexity, and capital investment needed before a product is launched into the market. Through this process, one of the fundamental aspects is how can we build the engineering rigor? And this plays into all the 4 aspects that are highlighted, which will come a little later in our presentation. Let's talk about a very unique aspect of this industry called as product recalls. Product recalls are basically when there is a identified problem or a corrective action that a company takes on its product, which is in the market. There are 2 types of recalls. Either a company says, I have a product in the market and it needs some corrective action and it is embarking on a journey to correct it. Or number 2, where it says that we need to remove this product from the market and do a thorough investigation. Both of them are called a product recall. And more often than not, almost about 95 to 97% of the product recalls are voluntary, which means a company does it on its own volition, rather than somebody coming and asking it to do it. Those instances are few and far in between. One of the interesting trivia is, we talked about a classification of a product, which is class 1, class 2, class 3. Class 3 product is that which has got a highest risk for when there is a failure. It provides the highest risk for its user or the patient. However, when it comes to product recalls, it is quite the opposite. So a class 3 product recall is one where the issue is not so grave, but a class 1 product recall is where the issue is very serious. Anyways, let's look at some of the top reasons why there is a recall. And as you will see, almost about 60% of the reason for the recall is primarily because of a software issue or a product quality issue or a risk factor issue. And these are the reasons why it is very important for when you're launching a product or you're creating a medical device or you're thinking about getting into medical devices. It's imperative to build that engineering rigor into this particular product development process. So now that we established a perspective in terms of why it is important, let's understand some nuances of how the engineering rigor is built into it. For instance, there is a quality management system that is a very integral part of the development process in a medical device. A quality management system is a document which is a guideline. It's just a guideline. And it perhaps includes a lot of data about the kind of procedures and processes that need to be adopted for a product that needs to be launched. However, we have seen in multiple cases where companies make a very complex and a convoluted product quality management system, such that sometimes it really thwarts our ability or the company's ability to build a product. So take my advice, quality management system should be a very simple yet effective document that is absolutely important, but adheres to certain simple measures for you to be able to launch the product. The fundamental aspect of quality management system is the rigor that is needed to look at every stage in the development. Risk management is another area which basically talks about the device classification and the risk associated with it. Now, in a risk management profile, we normally talk about what kind of risks does it provide. For instance, there is a concept called level of concern analysis. The level of concern analysis is one which defines the amount of risk analysis that needs to be done based on the classification of the product. For instance, for filing a regulatory documentation, you almost need to provide about 11 to 15 documents of software validation before a regulatory body is going to approve your product. These documents are going to cover things like hazard identification, failure modes, what is the intended functionality, and so on and so forth. So this becomes a very critical component of your development process. One of the biggest and most laborious and most expensive phases of engineering of a medical device is its design verification and validation phase. This typically, for a normal class 2 device, is the biggest, longest, and most expensive aspect of its product development lifecycle. And the reason why it is important is because not only are you required to look at the kind of intended functionality, you have to look at traceability. Is this particular design meeting the requirements where it started? And then at every stage, there is a stage gate review, which calls for cross-functional teams. You will need to have teams from quality, regulatory, clinical affairs, manufacturing, a multitude of teams that need to come in to review these documents to assess whether this can go to the next stage or not. And hence, this becomes a most critical part of your development process. And last one is document management and record management. So DHF stands for Design History File. Basically, it's a history of all the things that you have done on your design, all the changes that you have done. And DMR is a device master record. Basically, it gives instructions for manufacturing. So when a team takes a set of documents for regulatory approvals, they need to take the design history file, which basically articulates when you conceptualize your design to the time you completed the product, all the changes and the narrative of how the intended use has come about based on that design. So that is your design history file. It needs to have instructions for manufacturing the device, which is your DMR documentation. And then finally, your CER, which is your clinical evaluation reports, which basically talk about how is the product performing on the field. A combination of all these documents together is what will be evaluated by FDA before they give an approval. Now, let me throw one more complexity. Let's say you are trying to launch a product in US, and then eventually you intend to plan to launch the product in Europe or China. The rules of engagement slightly differ. The regulatory authorities will be different. For instance, let's take the example of QMS. For following QMS for a product that is to be launched in US, you follow what is called as a 21 CFR Part 820. It's a guideline that fundamentally tells you what is the quality management system that needs to be adopted for building a product. But if you want to launch the product at some point in time in Europe, then you need to adhere to a standard called ISO 13485. And if you were to think about launching a product in other countries, then there are certain different kinds of standards. All of these things need to be thought through in your design stage as you are putting your thinking hats in terms of how do I design a product. These are various facets that need to be thought through before you build a product. Similarly, for a regulatory approval, for instance, if you were to launch the product in US, we talked about FDA, but in Europe, which was basically up until about a couple of years ago, was basically the laboratory for medical devices globally. Why do we say laboratory for medical devices? Because most of the companies would create a product and they would first launch their product in Europe, because the level of stringent regulatory approvals was missing in Europe. And almost all the products, almost all the companies would take that as an approach in terms of either launching it in Europe or launching it in Canada, where the approvals are not as stringent. And then, we had certain adverse events in Europe. Perhaps about 10 years ago, there was a malfunction of a breast implant that caused caused harm to almost about 3,000 women that had the breast implant. That was perhaps the first sign when authorities came to a conclusion that it is important to have a different regulatory pathway in Europe. Today, there is a comprehensive plan that is put in motion where if a company needs to sell their products in Europe, they need to adhere with your EU MDR, which is European Union Medical Device Records approval pathway. Why this is important? This is important because when you're thinking of launching your product as future entrepreneurs, as future product development leaders, you will need to consider these kind of scenarios before you think about where you're going to launch your product, what kind of regulatory strategies that you need to adopt, what kind of standards that you need to incorporate, and the level of time that needs to be incorporated for your design verification and validation. Now we've talked a little bit about the economics of healthcare. We talked a little bit about how to launch a product or where to launch a product, and the engineering pathways and the rigor that need to be adopted. However, the whole healthcare industry is shifting away from a product to a patient pathway. It is imperative that companies do not think about a me-too product. 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, medical device industry was primarily a me-too product industry. Every company was thinking of launching a plethora of products in the market, and then there was a reimbursement. And the more products they launched, the more revenues they made. Up until 2010, when there was Affordable Care Act that was launched, and that took a constricted pathway of reimbursement. Basically, what it did was it restricted the reimbursement for products that are me-too products, which are not providing any value to the healthcare outcomes of the patients, which is when the industry started to think beyond a product. And in the last 10 years, companies have taken massive strides in moving away from a product to thinking about patient at the center of the ecosystem. So it will do you a world of good if you think not just on the product, but think more about the patient and what are the 4 aspects that one must think about. The 4 things that will help in thinking of a good product and helping your device company move forward in this space is, number one, are you creating a better outcome for the patient? Number two, is the standard of care improving? Number three, are you able to improve access to care? And last but not the least, is there a way that you are able to provide the patient an opportunity for him to take responsibility for his health, his or her health? If these questions are answered before you embark on creating a product, before you embark on thinking of launching a product, that will hold you in good stead. And hence, it is important to think about a patient pathway and not just a product pathway. So you probably would have heard this adage, data is the new oil. And it is ever so true in medical device industry. Most of the companies have started thinking about what are the new revenue streams. So they have moved away from selling just products. In the last 5 years, what we have seen is companies started to think about how can we create data monetization plans? Can we create data? There is huge amounts of data that is being amassed because of sensors and because of the new advent of technology. But the one thing which is the holy grail is how can we create a monetization pathway? This is our point of view in the way the industry is shifting, and it will perhaps give you a food for thought in terms of creating your own space to operate in this evolving trend within healthcare dimension. The first was a set of companies that started to operate as data observers. Now, we created a chart here, as you can see, where on the x-axis, we have device specificity, and on the y-axis, data specificity. So when a company has a single product, a particular device, and they wanted to extract the data of the device to primarily look at making improvements on the device or things like predictive maintenance on the device, those we categorize as data observers. So they basically extracted the data. They were observing the data primarily to bring better product or better service to their patients, where the device is important, not so much the data. Then we started to see an evolution of data enhancers. Those who started to say that the importance of product is not so much. I will start getting data from multiple devices. Let's take the example of a diabetic patient. Today, a diabetes patient will have a glucose monitoring device or a CGM, let's say, and then he or she will have an insulin pump, which will help inject an insulin automatically or by some therapy. And then he or she will have a mobile application. So when you are able to extract data, syndicate the data from all these three devices, and you are looking at a patient experience or a therapy, that is how you're trying to enhance data from multiple sources. So the data specificity is increasing, whereas the device specificity is decreasing. Then we have seen an explosion of data exchange. Let's take an example of an orthopedic company. These companies are now looking at how can we improve the patient experience, not just at the point of surgery, but perhaps pre-surgery, surgery, and in the surgery, surgical intervention, and post-surgery. And they are extracting data from multiple elements, not just from devices. So there is information from EMRs and EHRs, information from wearables, information about some pre-existing conditions and comorbidities, and they're able to create an ecosystem where that data is becoming very critical for surgical interventions. So there is a data exchange where the product or the device is becoming even less relevant, but the amount of data is becoming more relevant. And to the far right is where we believe the entire industry is going to move towards, which is to draw insights. The recent pandemic is a great example. When scientists world over needed to come together to fight the pandemic, they needed information sharing platforms. And that is how information sharing, not just in terms of your potential molecules that can provide these vaccines, but also in terms of your samples that can be extracted from multiple locations to see how this molecules can have an impact on them. Let's take a very simple example. We all have different kinds of flu shots coming up every year, right? The way companies work towards creating better flu shots is they extract data from a particular region to understand whether there is a particular strain of flu that has achieved immunity, and hence we need to create a new intervention. That data is very, very critical for population management scenarios. And hence, we will see more and more companies move towards data insights and creating therapies from data rather than getting more specific about a product. I hope you are able to understand the importance of how extraction of data becomes paramount in providing better healthcare rather than focusing on a product. Today, I'm sure all of you would have heard about Metaverse. In fact, in our age, while we feel that internet was the biggest change agent technologically, I think we are on the cusp of seeing something that is even more vast, and that is Metaverse. It's basically a convergence of virtual and physical worlds, where internet as we know it today will completely and drastically change. And what we believe could lead to better access to healthcare. For instance, take the simple example of gamification. The world has seen a massive shift in gamification thanks to Roblox and other entities. This gamification is a concept that can bring multiple parties together and provide better access to care. Augmented reality is another area where surgical procedures are being done with interventions that are being done not with geographic proximity, but with wisdom that is coming from world over. And these are ways in which you can improve access to care. In conclusion, before I open up for questions and have a conversation with you, I think there is a significant shift in the industry. What we saw about 20 years ago, where the industry was a very product-centric ecosystem in the medical devices world, is now becoming more and more data-centric, more and more intelligence-driven healthcare. That is going to augur well for us. Before I open up for questions, I have just one more slide. My dear friends, this is what I've learned in my life, and I thought I'll pass on this wisdom of what I have seen in my career. The first thing that I've learned is always to walk in your customer's shoes. It helps you understand what your customer is doing and how to better align with their priorities. Number two, keep your commitment no matter the price. Is something that is very core. I've learned this. I've learned it from my friends, from my superiors. It has held me in good stead. The last thing is, we all talk about work-life balance. There have been enormous amount of discourses on how important it is to create a work-life balance. But what I feel is, we all know what is work. We know that work begins at, let's say, 9 a.m. for somebody or 6 a.m. for somebody. It perhaps ends at 40 hours a week or perhaps 80 hours a week. So we know what is work, but we rarely define what is life. So please define what is life, and then that will help you in your careers and in your future. Thank you so much. I will now turn it over to Dan, and we'll be happy to take some questions.
Well, thank you so much, Partha. I'll do clapping for the collective whole. We had a really good turnout, so I appreciate you sharing your experience as well as your insight on so many things. So maybe I think we're going to have Corinna moderate the Q&A and take questions both from the chat, the room, and anybody who'd like to raise his or her hands online is welcome to do that. So Corinna, shall I turn it over to you?
Awesome. Well, first of all, Partha, that was great. That was an amazing talk, and thank you so much for being here today. So I'd like to open it up for the virtual audience to give them a second if they want to raise their hand, or anybody in the in-person audience, all of you guys. So any questions? Dimitrios, you put your question in the chat, so you can go ahead and ask yours.
Thanks, Corinna. Thank you so much for your talk. It was wonderful to kind of see the product development lifecycle for medical devices. I do work in the digital health industry now at Pfizer, and I was wondering if you had any experience with software as a medical device, and if this same type of product development lifecycle still applies to software.
Thank you. It's a great question. Software as a medical device is a very, very intriguing and a new concept. Basically, let's first of all define what is SAMD. Software, any software that is acting as a medical device in diagnosis or therapy is identified as a software as a medical device. For instance, if you are sending a patch upgrade to a product like an infusion pump, right? It runs on a simple embedded software. That is not SAMD. Software that can actually let's take an example of a neuromodulation case, where a patient who is an epileptic patient needs to be given a virtual treatment, and that virtual treatment algorithm is written into the device. That is classified as SAMD. The FDA has come up with recent new standards, which are very stringent, which need to be followed. I'm sure you are probably aware of that. This is a concept that is still evolving. And the good news is that it opens up channels for AI and ML to get in. Till today, the biggest challenge that most of the devices had was, how do you address a device patch upgrade? When you're sending a software patch, how do you manage that in an ecosystem? Some of these kind of functionalities will definitely be taken care in the new regulation that is coming up. I believe that the product life cycle will remain the same. However, the regulations that we talked about will be completely different. And those regulations which have recently been put out will need a huge amount of rigor. There is a nuance to it. What is the biggest challenge in regulating an SAMD? The biggest challenge is because of security guidelines. For instance, imagine, I think this was actually an episode that happened about 5 years ago, when a college kid went up on a stage and showed how he can hack into a Medtronic diabetes care product. I think it was on the news, everyone heard about it. That is the reason why this will go through a massive rigor in terms of managing the life cycle of a product development. So we will have to wait and watch how this evolves. Our experience, we are creating our own framework. So for instance, in HCL, we have a framework that has worked on digital technologies. We call it CARE, Connecting Assets in a Regulated Environment. It operates on 13485 and HIPAA standards, HL7 and so on and so forth. We have experience in creating SAMD algos, but I wouldn't say that we have full understanding of the regulatory laws that are coming out. We will have to wait and understand this before we can claim that we have done something on these lines.
I feel like the FDA is changing their thoughts on the by day. One other thought that kind of popped in as well, like as the CoLab obviously has an initiative for increasing access to healthcare and kind of reducing the cost of healthcare. Do you think that it's cheaper to build software as a medical device as opposed to a normal medical device, since it is kind of just software?
It depends on the intended functionality, Dimitrios, right? I mean, depending on the nature of the product that you're on paper, it makes a lot of sense. If you're building an SAMD, it makes it easier. Let's take a very simple example. Today, we hear so much about the shortage of chips in the market, ASIC chips or semi-chips are in the market. The best way to circumvent that issue is not to build a lot of fabs and semiconductor manufacturing foundries. The best way to tackle that problem is to create software that can circumvent the ASIC, right? Similarly, I'm just taking a kind of an example. An SAMD on paper makes it easier to address a medical device that can be launched easily, rather than going through your electromechanics and then you have these design reviews and these documentations. It can be very, very cumbersome. But till we understand the extent of this regulations, we'll have to wait and watch. But I think there is a lot of optimism and euphoria about SAMD, because that can really change in terms of taking the device industry into a completely different zone.
Definitely. Thank you very much. I appreciate the answer.
Thank you.
Kind of on that, continuing that conversation a little, how do you think the differing regulatory regimes in the United Nations, the US, et cetera, will affect data-driven health innovation?
Excellent question. For a long time, there has been a debate about healthcare innovation and is regulatory really stifling innovation? I have a very strong view about regulation is needed in this industry. And the reason why regulation is needed in this industry is because at the end of the day, these are products that are out there that are addressing your and my healthcare needs. Let's take a simple example. In June 2020, I think Philips had a product recall of a sleep apnea and a ventilator machine. By the time that information actually became public, right? So Philips announced this in their quarterly earnings in I think April or so, I don't remember the time. But by the time it actually transcended into an FDA recall, it took almost about 3 months from the moment they made a quarterly announcement to the time it actually came out. So regulations are very, very critical and important. And I think FDA has done a great job. Yes. Is there some ways in which we can look at accelerating it? Can we improve the process? Can we make it more faster, cheaper, efficient? Absolutely, by all means. So as I mentioned in my chat, I think to circumvent this, a lot of companies would actually launch their products in Europe. And that is how this episode that I talked about happened about 15 years ago, where there was a lot of impact to patients because of industry grade silicon that was used in a breast implant. Now imagine this, folks. Industrial grade silicon is used in a breast implant as opposed to medical grade silicon. And the kind of, one can shudder to think about those kind of things happening in the industry. And so you need regulations. It does feel that there is some element of stifling when there is these regulations, but we need to strike a balance somewhere.
Awesome, thank you. We wanted to ask one question from the RSVP form because everyone, or most people, submitted a question, which is really exciting. And one of the questions was, what are your thoughts about outsourcing device development? Does it impact access to investment?
It's a very interesting question. So when you think about outsourcing your device development, there are certain aspects that are very core to a company that needs to be kept within. For instance, your voice of customer, right? What are the products that you're going to build? What is the design architecture? What kind of regulatory environment you want to build? What kind of design architecture that you want to have? These are elements that I feel are very, very core and should never be, or never say never, but ideally are not good candidates to outsource. Places where you would want to think about outsourcing is those laborious, intensive tasks, which can be done with heavy amounts of automation, are ones which we should consider. For instance, testing. Software testing is a very big area. Verification, validation is a massive area. Secondly, I would suggest not just in terms of new product development. In fact, HCL, when we started, we used to do quite a bit of work, outsourced work for our customers in new product development. Today, our footprint in the medical device industry for new product development is very small. What we do is, once the product is launched, the amount of work that is needed in terms of keeping the lights on, once your product is launched, is huge. You will need to constantly be looking for what they call as post-market surveillance, the kind of regulations that need to be adhered to. There will be complaints that will be coming in. You need to be addressing those field issues. You need to be raising those CAPAs. CAPAs are corrective action and preventive action. You need to be looking at those. You need to be making engineering change orders. There is a ton of work that need to be done. I would actually recommend that those are better candidates for outsourcing rather than core device design or architecture. Just one more element on that, which can help you think through this. Today, companies are shifting their focus. So there was a time when, for example, a lot of these diagnostic companies used to have lab technicians doing testing in their labs. It was a very, very core function for them because they would want to keep the testing of the assays core. But now there is a shift. And that shift is companies are believing that developing a digital platform is core. So it depends on where you're thinking of what is core and what are your crown jewels. If you believe that these are your core aspects where you want to establish your strategy, I think that needs to be kept in-house because that is what is going to drive your competitive advantage. The things that can be outsourced will actually help you in faster, efficient reduction in cost. And that is how one has to plan.
That's some great advice. Thank you for that insightful answers. We have a little bit of time left, but I think this last question really kind of ties all the topics together. So you mentioned that the combination of the metaverse and healthcare. However, the cost of AR or VR headsets are quite expensive and not usually covered by insurance. Who do you think could pay for these AR, VR devices? Would patient, insurance company, or healthcare provider?
A very good question. So it is right now. Let's take the example of a couple of companies, what they're trying to do. They are trying to look at it in two ways. Number one, can an AR, VR device be qualified as a medical device? And very recently, I actually talked about it in one of my slides. I didn't cover it. Johns Hopkins did a augmented reality surgical procedure just about a year ago, where they implanted some spinal instruments. And when they did that, it's a beautiful video. I would suggest that you go on YouTube and watch that video. It basically talks about how the device is actually helping a doctor assist in his surgery. And hence, in that particular instance, that device will be classified as a medical device. And because it will be classified as a medical device, it will be paid for by the insurance company or the healthcare or the government, whatever be the case, right? But there are instances where a particular device may or may not be classified as a medical device. And there are many examples for that. So it is dependent on a case-by-case basis, but we will see a lot more companies embracing this metaverse and move into mixed reality. Some of them will be doing it for, let's say, training manuals. Like for instance, when at the heights of pandemic, we needed to train a lot of our nurses and doctors. These are instances where the virtual reality kind of a setup will be very useful in a training setup. Those obviously will not be qualified as a medical device. So I think it depends on the intended functionality and what they are delivering. And that is when it will be classified as a medical device, and which is when it follows a particular reimbursement pathway. I hope that answered your question.
What an exciting time, really, to be in this space, right, with the metaverse and how so much healthcare is changing. So thank you so much, Partha, for that answer. That was great. And so Dan, I'm going to turn it back to you to wrap up.
Great. I think we've reached the top of the hour. So my thanks again to Partha for spending the time to talk with us. My thanks to everyone in person, as well as all the people who are online for this talk. And we've also recorded it, so those who weren't able to attend can watch and learn. So much to learn. And there are more questions that we unfortunately weren't able to get to, but that means all the more reason to have Partha out in person when that becomes possible. And I'll just wrap up finally by saying that we'll be having the next Distinguished Speaker Series event coming up in about a month on March 3rd, featuring Mike Grandinetti, a serial tech entrepreneur who will talk about the role of startups in the healthcare ecosystem. So a nice complement to what Partha talked about today. So with that, thank you so much for joining us, and we're looking forward to seeing you for the next distinguished speaker. Thank you once again, Partha, and have a great evening.
Thank you so much, Dan and Karina. Thank you so much for giving me an opportunity, and have a great evening, all of you. Wonderful talking to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.